Take your Bible and turn to the book of Joshua. We'll start with verse 1 in the book of Joshua. The first page of your study guide is a historical review. We have finished the first 5 books of the Bible, the book of Moses, the Pentateuch. We have finished that. Joshua was born a slave in Egypt. At the time of the Exodus, Joshua was 40 years old. And of course, he spent the next 40 years roaming around with Moses. He was sent in at 40 years old to spy out the land. He came back. Caleb and Joshua said, "Oh yes, there's some big people over there, but it's a good land. God has given it to us, and we're ready to go up and take it." And so that puts him at 80 years old now when he's ready to cross over and claim the promised land. So he's about 80 years old. We end up in chapter 24 of Joshua, where Joshua dies at 110 years old, is where Joshua 24:29 takes leave of Joshua. We are moving toward the time when we can actually get a good date on biblical history. When does it actually take place, and how can we begin to start dating it? There are some way earlier periods for the Exodus, somewhere between 1400, 1500 BC. We're not really sure. The possible dating of the early dating is probably the most popular right now, somewhere around 1290 BC. So you'll see a question mark there. And if that be true, it leaves us at about 1250 is 1250 BC. That's 1250 years BC. When they actually start the conquest. One of the historical archaeological evidences for this date is it mentions some of the cities in Canaan, like Lachish, Debir, Bethel. All of those have records in their history, in archaeological history and in secular history, as having a time of war and destruction. So that fits in secularly, archaeologically, with this conquest, the invasion of the Promised Land and the invasion of Canaan land. So that's another reason for that. I went ahead and put in here, as we get ready to move in next week into Joshua, you will notice that the period, move into Judges, the period of the Judges is probably around 200 years. They move in, they conquer the land that we're going to look at tonight, and then a couple hundred years of the period of the Judges, about 1220 to 1020 BC. We call that the period of Judges, and then we start getting a whole lot closer to fine-tune, getting down to what we really think the calendar really says. So by the time of 1020 BC, Samuel is a judge. He's one of the last of the judges, one of the early prophets, but also in that category of judge. And so Samuel is born. He picks up in 1 Samuel. But in the book of Judges, we have that 200 period of time where they mess up, God delivers them. They mess up, and they get delivered by God raising up a judge. And then they start saying, "We want a king. Everybody else has got a king. We want a king. We don't want God to be over us. We want a king." And so that happens later on. And God said, "Okay, tell Samuel, go anoint Saul king of Israel." He does that around 1020 BC. Saul actually reigns for 20 years. And then the Bible tells us that he falls on his sword in Mount Gilboa. That's how Jonathan dies. All of that is in around 1000 BC. That's the way I keep up with all of the BC history and everything. By the time we get to the first king, Saul, and David, we're right at that time of 1000 years before Christ, 1000 years BC. And so David becomes king. He's anointed. We'll look at that when we get there, but just want you to know that David reigned for about 40 years. And so he actually dies 961 BC. Now there is a ton of evidence, archaeological evidence, secular evidence, historians, and all of that backs up this time of period. When David actually becomes king around 1000 BC, and he is king up until 9 961 BC. Reigns 40 years. Now, and then Solomon becomes king in 961. And so as you look at secular history, world history, archaeology, all of the evidence points to us, by the time we get to 1000 BC, we have a timeline for the Bible. So everything, and you've noticed here I put some question marks there on some of the earlier dates. We don't really know the exact dating, but now we're moving into the time with David. We know there's very little historical date about these, debate about these dates. And so the theme of Joshua is pretty simple. Moses has gotten them ready to go into the promised land. God takes Moses up on the mountain, shows Moses the promised land. If you look across the Dead Sea, there ain't a whole lot to see. It's barren land. If you've ever seen a picture of Qumran where the Dead Sea Scrolls were found, in my warped sense of humor, I think God took Moses up there, showed him across the Dead Sea, showed him that land over there, and Moses probably says to God, "You're kidding me. This is the promised land." And God said, "It's enough of you." So anyway, but basically when you look at it, God does show him all the way, as we looked at last week, all the way to the Mediterranean. He's able to see it, and he then dies and is replaced by Joshua. And it's a very simple breakdown on the divisions of it, of how it is broken out. The first 12 chapters deal with the conquest of the land, and then chapters 13 to 22, how the land is divided out between all of the tribes and who's getting what. And then the last two chapters, chapters 22 and 22 to 24, is Joshua's farewell. He has a few words to say, and that's how that closes. To help put the Bible in perspective, the Old Testament in perspective, it is a series of 17 books, 5 books, and 17 books. The first 17 books are the books of history. The first 5 being the book of Moses. Then the next 12 are the historical books. Take us all the way up to the 5 books in the middle, the personal books, the experiential books, the books of poetry, wisdom. You've got a little bit of Solomon in there, David, and David did not write all of the Psalms, but the Psalms are all there in the middle. And then at the end of the Old Testament, you come back with another 17 books. 5 of them are the major prophets, and 12 are the minor prophets. Major, minor, pretty much based on just the size of the book. Not that one has a more profound message or is a better prophet, but basically the size of the letter or the writing, the prophecy of those prophets. So you have 17, 5, and 17, and you have 5 and 12 history, 5 in the middle, and then you have 5 and 12 books of the prophets. And so we'll move on tonight and look at the outline of Joshua, the conquest. Another commentary on Moses, and I think a good word for all the rest of us to learn. If you look at the first couple verses of the book of Joshua, after the death of Moses, the servant of the Lord, it came to pass that the Lord spoke to Joshua, the son of Nun, Moses' assistant, saying, look at verse 2. Moses, my servant, is dead. How's that for an epitaph and a commentary? Doesn't go into any detail there except simply to say, now it's your turn, arise, go over Jordan. Because you can spend a lot of time dwelling on the past and talking about all of that. But I think one of the most valuable lessons to me in that verse is there is always a Joshua waiting in the wings. When we get to the point we think God can do without us, God's going to come along, raise up somebody else and say, he's dead. Now you're it. God can do that. I mean, he does that. I've seen him do that because God is able to accomplish his work. He's able to accomplish his will, and he is able to move on. So basically what God says to Joshua here is it's time to move on. And there's some words there. He reminds them, God reminds Joshua about some things. And then in chapter 2, this is a whole new issue. Now, he's sending in the spies, not really to check out the land to see if they're going to be able to go in. Joshua already knows what's over there. He is sending in spies to get the lay of the land so that when they do get there, they will have an advantage there. So there's some significance here in chapter 2 that we do not need to overlook, because we know what happens in verse 9. This is where the spies go in. They get discovered. They go to Rahab's house, and Rahab decides to hide them. You'll see that simply the question is, and if you look at verses 9 through 11 of Joshua chapter 2, and she said to the men, I know that the Lord has given you the land, that the terror of you has fallen on us, and that all the inhabitants of the land are faint-hearted because of you. For we have heard how the Lord dried up the water of the Red Sea for you when you came out of Egypt, and what you did to the 2 kings of the Amorites, who were on the other side of the Jordan, Sihon and Og, whom you utterly destroyed. And as soon as we heard these things, our hearts melted. Neither did there remain any more courage in anyone because of you. For the Lord your God, He is God in heaven above and on earth beneath. These 3 verses from Rahab are basically, she's saying to what she probably would say to a lot of us today, what took y'all so long? We heard what your God did. We heard how your God fought your battles on the other side. We heard how he divided the Red Sea and y'all were able to walk through on dry ground. We heard how when y'all got through and Pharaoh's army was destroyed by your God, our hearts melted. 40 years later, she's saying, we were terrified that y'all were on the way. Because not only did we hear about Pharaoh and the Red Sea, we heard what you did on the way. Because He's your God. And we were terrified. Neither did there remain any more courage in anyone because of you. For the Lord your God, He is God in heaven above and on earth beneath. And so He makes a covenant. She makes a covenant with them. They agree to it. That she knows what's going to happen, folks. Why? She has seen what God, their God, has done. She has already seen what your God has already done. And so they said, and so she says to them, when y'all do come in and destroy Jericho, will you save my family? She has hid them. She basically has saved their life. And now she's saying, I beg you, since I have shown you kindness, that you will also show kindness to my father's house and give me a true token, is what she asked for in verse 12. But look at verse 18, because what she says when she warns them and sends them on down the way. And they say, unless when we come, you bind this line of scarlet cord in the window through which you let us down, and unless you bring your father, your mother, your brothers, and all your father's household to your own home, so it shall be that whoever goes outside the doors of your house into the street, his blood shall be on his own head, and we will be guiltless. And whoever is with you in the house, his blood shall be on our head if a hand is laid on him. So this is the promise. Folks, this is one of the early times you will see that scarlet thread that runs through the Bible, pointing us to Christ and His shed blood. And so what they're saying is you let down the scarlet thread. You let down the red, the blood red, the type of the picture of Christ who by faith you will be able to be delivered. And so I think it's important. Not only that, some of you may already know this same Rahab the harlot. Now keep in mind, all the people, had they responded, would have been saved also. They all had the opportunity to be saved. The mayor of the town, all of those people, instead of chasing them, they could have just said, y'all come on in. We're going to, so God has a way of taking anybody. And that one of the lessons we learned from Rahab, not only is she and her family saved, She goes on to be the great-grandmother of King David. She ends up through her lineage and through her history, she follows that thread through Boaz. Remember, we'll look at Boaz and Ruth in a few weeks, but all the way through that lineage of the house of David that Jesus was going to come through, the house of David. So all of that prophecy is fulfilled through Rahab the harlot, which says to us, God will use anybody, God will save anybody. And it is up to us whether or not we are saved through faith in Jesus Christ. Chapter 3, they're crossing the Jordan, getting ready to go. When you look at chapter 3, they're getting ready to go over, and there's some instruction there. If you look at, and then chapter 4, it's important to know that as they cross over, they've got two sets of memorial stones. The first one they set up in the river. In verse 12, when he gathers a man from each of the 12 tribes. In verse 5 of Joshua chapter 4, the Bible says, Joshua said to them, cross over before the ark of the Lord your God into the midst of the Jordan, and each one of you shall take up a stone on his shoulder according to the number of the tribes of the children of Israel. That this may be a sign among you when your children ask in time to come, saying, what do these stones mean to you? And you'll answer them that the waters of the Jordan were cut off before the ark of the covenant of the Lord when it crossed over the Jordan. What do these stones mean? That's a great homecoming sermon. Because what it says is when your kids grow up and say, what does this mean? What does this church mean? It means God showed up and did something. A miracle happened here. And then go on over and he says, when you set up, verse 9 says, you set up the 12 stones in the midst of the Jordan in a place where the feet of the priest who bore the ark of the covenant stood, and they are there to this day. He says, so when the children say, what does this mean? You're able to tell them, God held back the waters and God's people walked through on dry ground. And then verse 30 on down the second time, and those 12 stones which they took out of the Jordan, Joshua set up in Gilgal. So they made an altar. And he spoke to the children of Israel, saying, when your children ask their fathers in time to come, saying, what are these stones? And then you'll say, let your children know, saying, Israel crossed over the Jordan on dry land. For the Lord your God dried up the waters of the Jordan River before you until you had crossed over, as the Lord your God did to the Red Sea, which he dried up before us until we had crossed over. Those memorial stones are significant because it's a reminder from generation to generation when the children say, what's these memorial stones about? Tragically, we are living in a day when we have people who are wanting to destroy everything, all the memories of anything and everything in America. Tear down everything. Tear down all the memories, all the memorials. And when you start tearing down Abraham Lincoln, Christopher Columbus, Teddy Roosevelt, and some of those folks, it ain't about what they think it's about. They're just tearing down the history. One step towards socialism, just destroy all of the monuments and all of those things. But make this memorial so that one day the children's going to say, what's that mean? And you tell them. You have a history, you have a heritage. And so that's where we find ourselves in the crossing of the Jordan, chapter 3, chapter 4. They are getting ready to cross over. There's some preparation. In the wilderness, there was no circumcision, and they're getting ready to go through all of that. And then as it comes time to go, in chapter 5 of Joshua, verse 13, Joshua, he goes out to look at Jericho. And when Joshua was by Jericho, he lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, a man stood opposite him with his sword drawn in his hand. And Joshua went up and said to him, are you for us or for our adversaries? Can you imagine? Joshua just walks up to him. A man's holding a sword there, and he said, are you for us or for them? It's kind of late to ask that question, isn't it? But, verse 14, he said, no, Let me preface this, what he's saying in verse 14. I'm not for you, I'm not for them. I am here as commander of the army of the Lord. I have now come. And Joshua fell on his face to the earth and worshipped and said to him, what does my Lord say to his servant? Verse 15. Then the commander of the Lord's army said to Joshua, take your sandals off your foot, for the place where you stand is holy. And Joshua did so. In our world, in our church world, in our Christian life, sometimes we ask ourselves, well, God, you on our side or their side? And the angel of the Lord just simply says, no, I am who I am. And I think what Joshua found out is it's not quite so important which side he's on, which side the angel of the Lord is on. The real question comes back and says, what side am I on? I'm not here to, I am a side. I am in charge. I am the commander of the army of the Lord, which is another example and another appearance of the pre-incarnate Christ. The pre-incarnate Christ. The commander of the Lord's army said to Joshua, take your sandals off, for the place where you stand is holy. And Joshua did so. So you get that picture of what's going on. Joshua, first of all, I wouldn't have gone that close to a man with a sword until you knew. Until you knew if he was on my side or your side. When we come to the incarnate Christ, the pre-incarnate Lord Jesus Christ standing there, he wants to know. He wants to know if you're on his side. It doesn't matter so much to him whether or not you are, or if you may think, oh, he's for them, he's for us. Who's he for? All of that. Churches do that sometimes. Who's he for? You know, is it for me or is it for them? Anytime there's confusion or conflict, folks, number one, don't ask God, are you for me or for them? Just say, am I on your side and are things right with me and you? That's the main thing. Always know that. Because immediately what he does is understand in the presence of the commander of the Lord's army, he is on holy ground. And so he settles that. Chapter 6 goes into the destruction of Jericho. Joshua settles everything. They're getting ready to go in. There's the battle there. He gives those instructions. There again, God is going to fight the battle for them. So what does he say? You just walk around 6 times. I'm sure the people's on the wall laughing at you or whatever they're going to do. It don't matter what they do. Here's what you do. 6 times. On the 7th time, blow the horn, shout, and the Bible tells us the walls came down. Jericho, it's interesting through the years, and I've seen videos. There's archaeological site at Jericho where the mound is, and they were pagan archaeologists said over the years, oh, this or that or the other, and have all kinds of interpretations about everything. But going back 50 years, they had something else to say about Jericho, and then they made some other interesting discoveries. Those walls really did fall out, not in. Had they sieged the walls, had they attacked the city, those walls and all the stones, all the rubble would have fallen in. But it didn't happen that way. All they did was walk around, blow the trumpet, give the shout, and the walls fell. And of course, Rahab and her family were spared. They move on. They go to a battle. In chapter 7, they get defeated. Now keep in mind, they were able to defeat Jericho. No fight at all. They go to Ai. They get beat. Joshua's having a pity party. I mean, he's on the ground, crying out and they beat us. What is that going to do to your great name? And God basically says, look at verse 10. The Lord said to Joshua, get up. Why do you lie thus on your face? That's not quite what you want to hear when Joshua, in his mind, has humbled himself before God and said, why were we defeated and become an embarrassment to you? But then listen to what God says. Verse 11, Israel has sinned, and they have also transgressed my covenant, which I commanded them, for they have even taken some of the accursed things, and have both stolen and deceived, and they have also put it among their own stuff. Therefore the children of Israel could not stand before their enemies. God had said, don't take anything. And there were times that God said that. There were times that God did not say that. There were times when God said there will be no spoils. Just destroy everything when you go in. And they find out why they were defeated. Because there was sin in the camp. That's another sermon for a whole long day. I mean, we can preach on sin in the camp. But you see what he says here in verse 21. They find out who it is, and then Achan simply says, when I saw among the spoils a beautiful Babylonian garment, 200 shekels of silver, and a wedge of gold weighing 50 shekels, I coveted them and took them. Verse 21 is a lesson in sin. Now keep in mind, sin has consequences. There is sin in the camp. The entire army of God was defeated at Ai because he's trying to teach them something. God has a very low tolerance for sin in our lives. Well, how does sin come into our lives? He says, I saw all that stuff. I coveted them, number 2. And number 3, I took them. The sin was not so much in the seeing. Covetousness is a sin, but it's only in your own heart and in your own mind and in your own head. When you see something and you want it. You see something that does not belong to you and you want it. But covetousness will lead you to sin. So here in verse 21, I saw it, I coveted it, and I took it. And there they are, hidden in the earth in the midst of my tent with the silver under it. So all of the bounty that he thought he really needed, that God said, don't touch it. It's all to be destroyed. So we see what happens there. So there was sin in the camp, and we deal with the sin of Achan. And he saw it, coveted it, and he took it. And then God moves on. They move on into the conquest, chapters 8 through 12. Of course, they go back. Now, y'all know what happens. Here's another lesson for you personally and as a congregation. When you deal with sin in the camp, you're able to move on, and God's able to bless you, and you move on. You know, you just move on. And the next chapter, chapter 8, of course, they go back to Ai. They're not defeated the next time because they deal with sin in their life. I think one of the lessons for us is when you're doing battle with the devil and he whips you up, well, ask yourself, why is the devil beating me up? Well, I don't know. There may be some sin in my life because God does not bless us. God cannot honor His commitment to us whenever we decide we're going to serve two masters. When we're going to follow the devil, we're going to follow God. Hey, that's not going to happen. So they get defeated the first time. Y'all know there's a lot of God's people walking around in defeat. I mean, they are in defeat. Well, deal with the sin, because then when you come back around, you can do battle with the devil and with the people of the world. And so he continues. Now, there are fights to be fought. There's battles to be fought. And in these chapters that follow on through there are more battles. In chapter 10 is where the sun stands still during the battle. They have opposition because they are invading somebody else's land. And the last part of chapter 10 down in there, they capture 5 kings. And they sort of they put a stone over the cave where the kings are and come back and deal with them later. But then they go ahead and defeat the rest of the armies. So what happens when the battle is over? Look what happens here in verse 24. So it was that when they brought out all those kings, to Joshua. And Joshua called for all the men of Israel and said to the captains of the men of war who went with him, "Come over here and put your feet on the necks of these kings." And they drew near and put their feet on their necks. These are the 5 kings. They have just defeated the army. And I think Joshua is giving us another object lesson. They were kings for a reason. I mean, they had lands, they had armies, they had, they were the king over their armies. And Joshua says to his captains, "Come over here and put your feet on their neck. Don't be afraid." That's a good lesson for us. Joshua said to them, "Don't be afraid, nor be dismayed. Be strong. Be of good courage." I think he's getting them ready to know, there's going to be another king. There's going to be another battle. There's going to be another obstacle. Verse 25, "For thus the Lord will do to all your enemies against whom you fight." Folks, that's a good object lesson. That's a good object lesson for us. Joshua, y'all come on now. Put your feet on their neck. That's what God's going to do for all of your enemies. That's a good lesson. So they go on and they continue the conquest of the south, and then they go up north. All of that land, they continue the conquest, continue the battles. They never actually capture the city of the Jebusites. That's interesting whenever he comes to Mount Zion, that area. It isn't until David becomes king that they actually defeat that one great, massive walled city. That was David's first battle that makes him king for sure, because he defeats that one last stronghold. And that's another story for another day. We'll talk about it later. But then in chapter 12, as we continue, 12 and 13, the conquering of the land, the continuing of the conquest, they go on and in chapter 12, basically a list of the kings defeated by Moses, and a list of the kings that's been conquered by Joshua. And then 13, they start finishing up conquering the land and dividing the land. The east of the Jordan, they've already said, remember the big sin of doing nothing? Reuben and Gad and half of Manasseh wanted to, as they were crossing over, they went to Moses and said, "Can't we stay over here? This is pretty good land." So they move on, but they're not able to go there, but that's their land. Then the land of Reuben, Gad, then they divide up, chapter 14 talks about west of the Jordan, which is Israel today, Canaan land. And it takes a while to sort of figure out in Israel, what's the West Bank? Well, the West Bank is not in the west. The West Bank is the west bank of the Jordan River, where Jericho is today. So the West Bank is the west side of the river. It's on the west side. So, and same today. So they divide up the land west of the Jordan. The promised land, Canaan land, is from the Jordan to the Mediterranean, north to south, all spelled out there. Caleb, I want to stop for just a minute in chapter 14 when we talk about Caleb. You remember the 2 spies that went in, Caleb and Joshua. Look at verse 7 of chapter 14. "I was 40 years old when Moses, a servant of the Lord, sent me from Kadesh Barnea to spy out the land, and I brought back word to him as it was in my heart. Nevertheless, my brethren went up with me, made the heart of the people melt, but I wholly followed the Lord my God." So here's Caleb. He is ready to claim his inheritance. Caleb said, "I was 40 years old then. I am 80 years old now." Caleb, 80 years old. And he basically says to Joshua, "Give me my mountain. Just give me my mountain." Because he is claiming that inheritance. And so in those verses, we see Moses swore on that day, saying, "Surely the land where your foot has trodden shall be your inheritance and your children's forever." And verse 10, "Now behold, the Lord has kept me alive, as he said, these 45 years, ever since the Lord spoke his word to Moses while Israel wandered in the wilderness. And now here I am this day, 85 years old. Look at verse 12. Now therefore give me this mountain of which the Lord spoke in that day. For you heard in that day how the Anakim, I remember what I've said previously about the I am ending in Hebrew is plural. So there's a bunch of them, the Anakim peoples, were there. And that the cities were great and fortified. It may be that the Lord will be with me, and I shall be able to drive them out, as the Lord said. Now, let's look in Caleb's head for just a minute. Y'all remember 40 years ago when we came back? Remember, oh yeah, the other 10 with me, they saw them giants too. And they came back and made a report. And it says in verse 8, the heart of the people melt because of that report of them big people. Caleb said, yeah, I know what's over there. So, see, Caleb is reminding Joshua, hey, we know what's up there. But that's the land promised to me. Yeah. So, you've got this land of the giants that destroyed the hearts, melted the hearts of the people of God. The 10 spies said, no, yeah, it's a good land, but we can't take that land. So here it comes time. Remember, we're dividing the land. Caleb says, remember me? God promised this land. So Hebron, which ended up being the original place where King David started out at Hebron, that's where he became king, was anointed king, and ruled there for a couple years before he decided if you're going to be king of all of Israel, then he has to move, and Jerusalem became the center there, and that's where he ended up being. And so chapter 17, you got 15, 16, 17, dividing up the land. Chapter 17 starts with the other half, the west side of Manasseh, the other half, because half of them stayed on the east, half of them moved to the west. And then chapter 19 and 20, you look at, it just continues to spread out the towns, the inheritance, Simeon, Judah, Zebulun, Benjamin, the smallest of the tribe, the tribe of Benjamin got Bethlehem. So you have Benjamin and Judah is the southern kingdom. We'll look at that later on. The 10 tribes to the north became Israel after the death of Solomon. You have a united kingdom up until the time from Saul through David and then through Solomon. Once Solomon dies, for reasons we'll look at later on, the kingdom splits. The 10 northern tribes and then the southern tribes of Judah and Benjamin are Judah. They become Judah. That's why Bethlehem was in Judah, with Judah and Bethlehem. So that's important to know that. So they go through all of those things. And he sort of cuts out some important places in the kingdom. Chapter 20 deals with the cities of refuge. If somebody's after you because of something you've done, there is a place where you can find safety. We'll sort it all out later, but they can't come in here and get you here. It is a place of safety. God always provides a city of refuge, a city of something that is safe for you. Verse 4, when he flees to one of those cities, he stands at the entrance to the gate of the city, declares his case in the hearing of the elders of that city, and they shall take him into the city as one of them and give him a place that he may dwell among them. So that's the cities of refuge. Chapter 21 is the city of the Levites. You know, the priests really had no inheritance, but God provided for the priest. He took care of them. They were to live off of the tithes, the offerings, and the Levitical priesthood was to be taken care of by the people. They did not have an inheritance as such, but they did have cities that were theirs. And so chapter 21 concludes, the Lord gave to Israel all the land of which he had sworn to give to their fathers, and they took possession of it and dwelt in it. The Lord gave them rest all around according to all that he had sworn to their fathers, and not a man of all of their enemies stood against them. And the Lord delivered all of their enemies into their hand. In verse 45, not a word failed of any good thing which the Lord had spoken to the house of Israel. So we come to the end of chapter 21. They have conquered the promised land. They are there. They have divided everything up. They've settled in. and we end up with, it is the promise fulfilled. They have taken possession of the land, and chapter 22 begins with those tribes that are going east of the Jordan, they head home. They'll go home and get their possession. There's altars there to be built, and chapter 23 is Joshua's farewell address. He has a lot of words to say to the people. I won't read all of them, but I think I do want to point out verse 6 of chapter 23. Joshua says, "Therefore be very courageous to keep and to do all that is written in the book of the law of Moses, lest you turn aside from it to the right hand or to the left. And lest you go among the nations, these who remain among you, you shall not make mention of the name of their gods, nor cause anyone to swear by them. You shall not serve them, nor bow down to them." Verse 9, "For the Lord has driven out from before you great and strong nations. But as for you, no one has been able to stand against you to this day." Here's a verse for you to memorize. Verse 10, "One man of you shall chase 1,000, for the Lord is your God. The Lord your God is He who fights for you, as He promised you." That's His promise. One of you can defeat 1,000, as the Lord has promised you. That's a good word for us. They finally, 40 years later, a generation later, Caleb and Joshua, two of them. Yeah, two of them. Caleb reminds them, yep. The other 10 spies came back, gave a bad word. They were scared and y'all didn't come in. And Caleb says, "Give me my mountain. I'm here to claim it." And he did. He did. And the closing words from Joshua is in chapter 24, verse 13. "I've given you a land." This is God speaking to the people. "I've given you a land for which you did not labor, cities which you did not build, and you dwell in them. You eat of the vineyards and olive groves which you did not plant. Now therefore fear the Lord, serve Him in sincerity and in truth, and put away the gods which your fathers served on the other side of the river and in Egypt. Serve the Lord." Now here is the challenge of Joshua. I trust you are familiar with this, and I hope you have memorized this, men especially. I'm sure there were a lot of Father's Day sermons preached on this. Verse 15 of Joshua chapter 24. If it seems evil to you to serve the Lord, in other words, if you don't think that's good enough for you, choose for yourselves this day whom you will serve, whether the gods which your fathers served that were on the other side of the river, or the gods of the Amorites in whose land you dwell. And Joshua says to them, "But as for me and my house, we'll serve the Lord." You can go back to the way you used to be and you serve those gods, or you can just blend in with the people around you and start following after their gods. You got to decide. And he gives that example and that challenge, and he just simply says, "As for me and my house," the man that speaks for his house, we're going to serve the Lord. Y'all do what you want to do. And then verse 29, "It came to pass after these things that Joshua the son of Nun, the servant of the Lord, died being 110 years old." Look at verse 32. Y'all may have thought I was kidding you, but talk about the promise, the prophecy, and the commitment of Joseph. He understood there was a land of promise. The children of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, Joseph's father Jacob. Joseph understood the promise. Y'all know what I told you when they were getting ready, when Joseph died. Genesis ends when Joseph dies. He calls them all together and said, "Promise me, when y'all get out of slavery, when you move from this land and into the promised land, take my bones with you." And then we go back to Exodus 13:19. They're getting ready to come out of slavery. Exodus says, they bring the bones of Joseph with them. 40 years in the wilderness, they are carrying the bones of Joseph. There again, that prophecy, the belief in the covenant and the promise of God. In verse 32, the last part of Joshua chapter 24, the bones of Joseph, which the children of Israel had brought up out of Egypt, they buried at Shechem in the plot of ground which Jacob had bought from the sons of Hamor, the father of Shechem, for 100 pieces of silver, and which had become an inheritance of the children of Joseph. That may not even strike y'all the way it strikes me, except he knew there was a promise, the promised land. He knew that God made a promise to Abraham, repeated it to Isaac, and Joseph's father Jacob. He knew there was a promise made by the God of heaven. He believed that promise. He's saying, I may not see it, but it's going to happen. I want you to take my bones with you when you go. What do those bones of Joseph mean? It means there was a promise fulfilled by them, the people of Israel, and a promise fulfilled by God. Because God brought them to the promised land. Let's pray. Father, thank you for your word. I pray that you might help us to apply it to our lives. Teach us your truth. Help us to be the people that you want us to be as we live out the victory that you have promised to us. For those who may be struggling tonight, Lord, I just pray that you would give them the victory. Help them to turn their hearts and their minds toward you. Shut out all the distractions of this world. Shut out all the temptations. We see so many things these days that would lead us astray, but help us to stay faithful. Help us to stay focused on you and your word. For it's in Jesus' name we pray. Amen.